G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a great week. Now, as many of you are aware, I'm at the pointy end of my treatment cycle at the moment. So I am feeling pretty unwell, and with this I get a lot of brain fog, a lot of fatigue, a lot of frustration, a lot of everything. So just deal with me, and if you don't see me for a couple of days, I apologize, but as always, we will catch up on what we missed. And I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to getting this treatment done and dusted and seeing if there's been actual result from a long treatment as well. But legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to speak about. So, of course, we're going to speak about Pokrovsk. Now, not just that Pokrovsk push that happened on the east. We need to speak about Pokrovsk actual. What is actually happening in there? DRGs, map movements. We've got a lot of geolocated footage, and I've got a lot of different maps to show you as well. And this is, I think, the only way to get a good idea on where that front line sits. Now, as you're aware, I'm not a mapper, so I've figured the best way to do it is go off many different sources with many different biases and see what is lining up. And that is our threshold. We'll talk about that situation. Of course, then we'll move on to the east and that push, that breakthrough, or that collapse that occurred, depending on what language you want to use. And we'll look at the containment of that, what's actually happening, a bit of where there's a lot of fog at the moment, some geolocations again, and then we'll move on to the maps in a broader way and look at some areas of which we said could be vulnerable given the forces move to Pokrovsk. What is happening there? Then we'll have a bit of miscellaneous. We'll talk about India and China. We'll look at a fuel train that is on fire. And at the end of this, we need to do a little bit of just a brief wrap up on the talks between Trump and Putin, Trump and Zelensky and the European leaders, and where this negotiation is headed and what is meant by Article 5 like. And then I'm going to go a little bit further and talk about victory in the war, how the war has changed and evolved, and how the war in of itself, as far as not only the goals, but why things are being fought, that is evolving and affecting soldiers and then the populations behind the scenes too. So there's a lot in that. And basically give my answer of, do I think that any of these negotiations are going to be successful? So, of course, as always, a lot to go through and over. So, of course, here we have Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check or the blue check are movements for Ukraine or Russia over the past 24 hours. But the first place we're going to come down into is Pokrovsk. Now, some areas of which you need to be familiar with is Pokrovsk, of course, Minograd, Roryanske, Novokononachny as well. So we're going to come into here, and this map hasn't moved on this sector for some time. And AMK Mapping, he said this just before I went live today. Pokrovsk city centre, supply to the city has improved for Ukraine following the clearing of DRGs, these reconnaissance sabotage groups to the north. All of Pokrovsk has been cleared of Russian DRGs except for the half in the Kalinivka district in the south, which is under actual Russian control. The lines have solidified for now. So areas in the south are under actual control, not just these forward reconnaissance elements being there. Now, one thing I will say, in somewhere the size of Pokrovsk and Minograd, once there is a spotting of one DRG in an area, as an infantryman, I would never be confident that there were zero others. It's like if you find one mine, you can't assume that there is nothing else. But we have seen DRGs working all the way up into the centre, north of Pokrovsk, over the following weeks and days as well. But let's have a little bit more of a zoom in, see what is happening. Let's look at then Syriac maps. Now, he speaks about these areas, of course, near Zvezda that is being pushed back by the Ukrainian forces, but he's also saying near Trunishine that the Russians are making some ground up into this sector as well. As Mr. Alex from History Legend says, that they may use the tree line and the railway here as a bit of a buffer to move and swing around into Pokrovsk on that certain axis. Let's do a little bit of a deeper dive on this area from Thorkill 65. Fantastic open source intelligence mapper as well. Again, go and follow these guys. Situation on the Novokononachny Pokrovsk region. So this region that we're talking about right in here, as I pointed out to you. 3 days ago, the Ukrainian side boasted about setting a world record sniper hit for 4,000 meters. This was also a claimed double kill. So the ghost of Heckler and Koch has now resurrected in Pokrovsk, which incidentally revealed that Russian units likely belonging to the 5th or 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade captured an industrial complex consisting of the Capitala mine and the central processing plant at this geolocation located between Novokonomachny and Minograd. And I've got this in that like blue Tiffany color, which is right here. Let's move down onto the deep state map, and this is that sector, this industrial sector right in here, that has then indicated of where the front line has likely moved to. The loss of the mine also indirectly involved that Ukrainians were forced to withdraw from the resistance points that held until now in the northwestern part of Novokonomachny. So he's saying if they're right in here, this northwestern part may have to be, so if they're in here, has to have been abandoned. Currently, only a field approximately 1.5 kilometres long and a flanking position in the buildings of the ventilation shaft number 3 of this mine at this geolocation in the yellow separate the Russian forces from the easternmost houses of the 8th micro district. However, the units of the 5th Motorised Rifle Brigade are unlikely to launch an assault on Minograd from the east, limiting themselves for now to merely blockading the city. The entire effort of the 51st Army has been focused since June 25 on encircling the Pokrovsk agglomeration from the northeast, either through breakthrough in the Rodensky area or in the vicinity of Dobra Pilia. So the real effort here is not to close across these open ground onto the city, is to encircle it Rodyansk or towards Dobra Pilia, which I agree with. Now, in the yellow, this area he's talking about is just cropped off in this map. But what he is speaking about is this is the industrial area, and right where I am right there, with my cursor, that is the mine that he's speaking about, and there's 1.5 k's of open ground before coming into Minograd, Pokrovsk area itself. But we are seeing Russia hit this area very hard with FAB glide bombs. Now I've put in the industrial area, the mine, and where this glide munition then hits. Like with every munition, Russian pages claim that they're all Fab 3000s. No, this is definitely not. This is probably a 500 or maybe 1500 that is hitting in that area. But you can see the road leading in, and you get an idea from this map down this road where this area and the open ground is from Novokonomachny, where they likely hold the industrial facility as well, trying to weaken that extreme western front where, of course, you'll have everything from ISR through to lethal capability as well. We saw the very same happening before the open fields of Siversk. So let's push up into the east just here. We have Kucherov Yar, Zolota Kolodyads, Vesely, areas I'm sure you're familiar with. But this is very, very foggy of what is actually happening here. So, of course, the deep state map show what the deep state map is showing. There's blue that was never red, that was never grey. There's areas that were never grey that probably should be blue and recovered, as far as some of these towns and settlements out here. And there's maps that show that there is no cut off like ISW today, and this is Kucherov Yar right here, shows that it has been recovered down on the north, pushing from the east and west, but that it is more of a solid front line, not a cut-off, also making some ground just to the east of here around Poltavka region 2. So it's very difficult to know. Then you have Suryak saying this, securing Kucherov Yar, also taking back some areas in here as far as the mine too, that relates to Thorkill, and this one relates, of course, to where Belitsky is shown by the deep state map. But I hope this gives you an idea of just how difficult it is to assess where that northern extreme is actually sitting. It does seem that Kucherov Yar is somewhat under Russian control, but whether it's split in two, that's more where the argument becomes. This map is showing it, ISW isn't, Suryak isn't, AMK isn't. Now, we do know that Russia is trying to build the base here, and we do have a geolocation here. I can't show you the next slide because it, of course, is sensitive, but we see that a Ukrainian drone has targeted a Russian soldier right on this area. So we know definitely grey zone, and there's a lot of targeting in here, but we can see building that base would be very, very important. Now, What does Mr. Playfair say about this? Well, he's somewhat in between. He says, more information about the trap Russians there, according to my information. There seemed to be quite a lot there recently. We're talking about right near Kuchtiv Yar. It looks like the encirclement was indeed real, and all the forces sent to Salty Kolodiars slowly retreating inwards into the cauldron and now concentrated in that forest. We're talking of tens and tens. Again, I don't know how much that is, because apparently there's been 1,400 already killed in here. Right now, Russians are shelling them with multiple launch rocket system, an example of these actions here. For now, they're always inside some old trenches there, so it's difficult to directly dislodge them. To save so much manpower as possible, the Ukrainians are not planning to conduct a clearing operation, but rather to starve them to death because of the lack of food and water, although we do know multiple times food and water and ammo is being delivered by drones all up and down the front line. So he shows this. So he shows Kuchtiv Yar, that it is to the south of here, and that there is Russians in a small pocket of trees sitting just down in here that is currently surrounded by Ukrainian forces. Now, there's been a lot of pushback against Mr. Playfair's map, and he admits himself that it could be incorrect, but he does state that his sources have so far been reliable, which I can agree with, that he has been fairly reliable on these maps. And of course, no one is going to know exactly what is happening in here, especially with the chaos of it. Shit, there might be commanders in here not know exactly where that zero line is sitting. Preliminary info: the red bubble has been cleared and there's prisoners. Skal's claim of having cleared Pokrovsk from Russian DRGs is true. We'll dig further into both and post about it later. So backing up what AMK is saying, that Pokrovsk has been cleared from DRGs, and apparently this area here, this tree line, has been cleared as well. Again, it's incredibly difficult to know. And speaking of the Pokrovsk push, the breakthrough, whatever you want to call it, it's very unclear to visualize what actually occurred and the current situation. And this is where we have to fall back on our knowledge, our training, and our doctrine. I think the Russians had, this is going to sound weird, but too much initial success in this sector, leading to an overextension and potentially a dislocation. Now, what do I always say about attritional war? That the goal is to move forward within your bubble of friendly protective systems, your artillery, your ISR, your supporting fires, your electronic warfare, all of that. Now, this bubble in this war seems to be about 10 to 15 kilometres, but that's from the system themselves. Now, due to the lack of any initial resistance and not a breakthrough, a walkthrough, to quote many bloggers, it seems that some of these DRG elements have moved well beyond this range, up to 20 Ks or further. So you've moved outside of that friendly bubble of protective systems. Another factor of offensive operations, which you'll hear me say again and again, is simultaneous and successive operations. This is important even if your initial attacks fail, to have simultaneous and successive operations. This is ultimately why Kursk failed to gain any tactical benefit, there was an operation in one sector, but it didn't have simultaneous and successive operations. It was, like this is seeming, a singular assault on a singular axis that opposing forces, given that it's in one area, can deploy resources to contain, like we saw in Kursk, like we have seen here. After that initial success, it can be contained because it's on one area. This is why you have simultaneous, successive, even if it's successful, even if it's a failure. It may be too early to tell, and of course this is on a much more limited scale than something like Kursk, but so far it doesn't look like simultaneous and successive actions have been exploited. One thing though, is even taking the most conservative deep state map measurement. So we take from just back here to somewhere near Vilna, that there has been around 7 or 6.5 kilometers that has been taken, and it is looking like it is holding. But this isn't the whole story, nor is the distance, if it was 20 or if it's 5. Ukraine containing and stabilizing this, even if they would have managed to destroy the whole push, doesn't discount the problems this exposed. The systemic command and manpower problems and shortages that led to this happening. This was an opportunity more so than an exploitation. And that in this that's the real disaster. The square kilometre loss or gain is a byproduct of attrition and tactics, but what this has exposed is far worse than the push in of it itself. So let's continue on the maps. And of course, we've spoken about other areas potentially becoming far more vulnerable due to this. So let's move out of here and we come to Konstantinivka. Now, many are saying that there are operations coming into Konstantinivka. Some are saying it's propaganda, flag waving. Again, wait out. It's very, very difficult to know what is happening. I don't have anything for you today, but the other area we're talking about is Siversk. And we can see Serebryanka in this forest here, the Kremenar forest, an area which is held for many, many months, is starting to move. Now, Mr. Play for himself says Deep State is well behind on what is actually happening in this area. So this is in the north of Siversk, but in the south around Viminka, we don't see much movement here for some time either. Well, we do see a geolocation today. So we see Viminka, right where this is turning here. We can see there are Russian forces moving through some built-up positions as well. Then we need to come into Kupyansk, to I think the most concerning geolocation of the day. So we have Kupyansk, an incredibly important area. Let's bring up this geolocation. What we see is this is a Ukrainian tank firing on this building here that supposedly has Russian forces within it. Okay, well, let's have a look at where the geolocation of this actually is. It's right in here. So if we zoom in, where we're talking about is right in this sector right here, which is a long way back from the line, and Kupyansk under the same tactics and operations of these fires, DRGs, exploitations, may be coming into a very similar process of what we have seen unfold in Pokrovsk. And this, of course, is what we could see more and more of up the front line, as we do know a lot of elements are getting moved around to contain this. And the reason why it's more stable in here than it may have been a week ago, even before this, isn't due to magic and myths and legends. It's due to redeployment of forces, which will leave other areas more vulnerable. Come down into Velika Novosilka front line, and we can see here near Orhivske is coming further under control, and movement just north of here being confirmed by the Suryak map through Temerivkia. Multiple maps are backing up there's movement in this sector. So just keep an eye on everything. Again, we've been in a very weird part of the war because there's been a lot of talks between Trump, Putin and Zelensky, and has been wanting to exploit propaganda but also hide informational warfare. I think all of this is going to become a little bit more clear in the coming days and weeks. Now, we do know logistics are very, very important. And we do see from Ukrainian drones today that this fuel train, a Russian fuel train, on fire being targeted by Ukrainian drones. Now, where this occurred was between Tokmak and Uruzane. So we'll just zoom down to show you exactly where that is. This is Tokmak, and then just to the east, we have Uruzane, and you can see there's a train line that runs then between the two. So somewhere along there, that has been targeted. We've heard for a long time that there may be more Russian actions down in this south region. We have seen that move more recently. Now, Narendra Modi, of course, the leader of India, has posted this on his X. Glad to meet Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Foreign Minister of China. Since my meeting with President Xi in Kazan last year, India-China relations have made steady progress, guided by respect for each other's interests and sensitivities. I look forward to our next meeting in Tianjin on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. Stable, predictable, constructive ties between India and China will contribute significantly to regional as well as global peace and prosperity. Now, this SCO summit visit will actually be Modi's first time in China for 7 years. And India is very, very important. India is far more important. It's well beyond the memes that you'll see people make on Instagram. And we've spoken about India, of all the major states, holds the strongest balance of sovereignty. And the three pillars of sovereignty are trade, military, and energy. And India has a foot in multiple doors, in the east and in the west. They have diversified trade, Russian and Western military equipment, and energy split between the Middle East, Russia, and a lot of others. Because of this, any move by one bloc to restrict, India can counterbalance by leaning on the others that are already in play. If America doesn't want to provide fighter aircraft, Russia will lean on UAC, vice versa. We see that all the time. So you can't just completely cut off. This is where many have pushed back and gone, whether you ideologically agree, you cannot say that Europe has become more independent and sovereign due to the sanctions against Russia, because now they're solely reliant on America, which is great for now. But if America says jump and they control your energy, your military, and a lot of your trade, you have to say how high. Now, Trump's tariffs, they won't force India closer to Washington. They will more likely push Delhi to participate more with China and Russia and BRICS. And this is always where that can backfire massively. And on the day we saw this being discussed, and of course, massive bellicose arguments coming out from Trump about India, what we see was India tweeting and making statements about bringing closer to China or about their own independence and sovereignty. Now, of course, we've seen a lot of negotiations around this war and where this will end. And this Article 5-like guarantees we keep hearing the Europeans sprout off. This was from someone behind the scenes. By the way, I take a very different view of security guarantees. Sure, they might not be quite NATO, but what is NATO? It's just a treaty with some articles, mainly Article 5. If Ukraine seeks Article 5-like guarantees with the same binding language as Article 5 and the same countries, or at least the main ones, US, France, Germany, then what difference does it make? And that's the problem. If Russia won't accept Ukraine in NATO, they won't accept such guarantees either. I wrote this back in March and I haven't changed my mind. However, it was one thing for Zelensky to try this cheap trick, and it's quite another for a dozen EU leaders to support it. And I wonder whether they really believe it can work, or they're trying to drive a wedge between Trump and Putin by convincing the former that it's a reasonable idea and that the latter is being unreasonable by refusing it. And I think that is very, very right. That it's not just NATO. Yes, it may have been said the war is against Ukraine not joining NATO, but it's against that security and the movement of West into Ukraine as well. So if it's Article 5-like, if it's going to have the same outcome, Russia's not going to accept that and they will continue the war. And this is a piece I wrote up just before today. Following the meetings between Trump and Zelensky and Trump and Putin, there is, of course, massive speculation about peace agreements, security guarantees, and territories. It is clear that Ukraine has softened its position regarding de facto occupation and the inability to meet with Putin. On the surface, it appears that Putin has softened his position in regards to de jure control of the 4 oblasts that he considers Russia, not wanting all of Zap, all of Kherson. Although I am highly suspicious that this is merely political theatre from Putin to delay sanctions and seem more reasonable to Trump. Given even these softened positions and the sunken cost fallacy of this war, there is no middle ground because the goals are still far too far apart. Russia is set on taking the Donbass not only through negotiation, but militarily if it must. The key difference in positions is there is a possibility, regardless of how costly or slow, it is possible that Russia can take these territories by force. It is an impossibility, disregarding some black swan event, but it is an impossibility that Ukraine can take these areas back by force. So although it would be costly, although it may be long, although it may be years, it is possible that Russia can take it back by force. It is impossible that Ukraine can take these back by force. And in realpolitik terms, to a realpolitik leader like Trump, this is a very, very important difference. While the Russian forces continue forward, albeit slow but increasing in pace, and Ukraine's position on the battlefield through morale, through AWOL and desertion and recruitment is deteriorating. What is the incentive other than a better deal through negotiations or delaying for Russia to stop the war? On the other hand, for Ukraine cannot just give up cities. It has fought for years, and of course with massive fortifications around that would then become under the Russian control. Because doing so and giving this up, it would jeopardize Ukraine's political position, its economic future, it would shatter morale and risk massive internal unrest. as well as NATO, EU, US credibility globally that will be painted around the world as another failure in a war, from Afghanistan to Vietnam to this. Western aid keeps Ukraine in the fight, but it does not change the fact that Moscow sees negotiation as little more than codifying battlefield realities. For Russia, victory is based on influencing Western security inside of Ukraine. Whether it is NATO or whether it is Article 5-like, it's based on influencing that security. For Ukraine, victory is more clearly defined. It's got borders and full sovereignty and independence, NATO, EU, etc. It is more clearly defined what will be a victory or a failure. Now, while their militaries, the Russian and Ukrainian militaries, still stand in the field, this leaves both sides locked into a war that will not be broken by diplomacy or outside pressure. It will run its course on the battlefield, with the end determined not by handshake or deals, but by who still has the strength to stand when the other side cannot. And I'm still more leaning towards where Big Serge says it will be fought to its conclusion. It's just too far apart. Now, this is a conversation for another day. But the way that Russia and Russians view this war has shifted. And it's been a very big shift. And it's been for Russia's ability for further troops on the battlefield and lengthening of the war. It has been a very positive shift for them too. It no longer sees this as the special military operation or simply an operational war to influence Ukrainian domestic politics and security guarantees and decisions. Many inside Russia now frame it as a conflict that began as a limited operation to have effect here, but with the Western involvement, the Western backing on Ukraine, and of course trying to freeze Russia out of this, that this has evolved into a struggle or a war or a conflict against liberal modernity and their way of life. That it's against liberal modernity itself. It's no longer just about Ukraine not joining NATO and taking Donbass. Now, whether one agrees or disagrees with the framing of the war, that is irrelevant. What matters is the war has transformed from Ukraine versus Russia into something presented more as a fight for Russia's survival itself, seen by many Russians. And this is why we see far less anti-war pushback today in Russia than we did at the beginning, and where we see recruitment skyrocketing. That is not purely just because of sign-up bonuses. The war has changed from trying to influence Ukraine's politics and NATO to people seeing this as a great war against liberal modernity. And you see this through the Russian propaganda channels painting themselves as the bad guy, trying to paint of traditionalists, even through then Putin's decrees or by the gay liberal West or whatever you'd say. And that's where I've seen this huge shift in the informational sphere that of course influences the civilian population, that influences the military, is this war has changed from a war, a special military operation, a war against Ukraine, to now this war against liberal modernity. And why that they say is an existential threat, I think has beefed up the nationalist support for this war. Now, whether you disagree or agree with that, as far as is that a threat, that's it doesn't matter. That's regardless of that's why I believe it's influencing then all these people to sign up or actually further support the war. Legends, I hope you have a fantastic day. I really struggled with today's video in my head. I'll see if I can make one tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.